Hey, what's up? Today we're going to do a pretty fun homebrew, the Baltic Style Porter. Thought I'd take this opportunity to document the entire process, start to finish. If you're new to homebrewing, or if you've already have a couple brews under your belt, maybe you might find some inspiration to try this style, or get a few tips and tricks you might not have tried before. We're going to go over everything, the style, the ingredients, making and stepping up the yeast starters, our water profile, brew day, keg fermenting and lagering, all the way up to bottling with our counter pressure filler. The whole process is going to take about 2 months. So let's get started and take a look at the Baltic Style Porter. Early British porters were cheap to make and didn't spoil too easily, and quickly became a favorite among the working class, hence the porter moniker. British breweries started pumping out huge quantities of porters and started exporting to Russia and the Baltic states, who fell in love with the strongest versions of the style, especially Russia, giving rise to the Imperial Russian Stout. The Baltic states started brewing the style themselves during the British naval blockade during 1806, which slowed the flow of British beer to the Baltic region. Due to the colder temperatures, they tended to use lager yeast, lending a cleaner and smoother roast character to the style. After World War II, the style became somewhat forgotten in Western culture, but by the end of the Cold War, a resurgence of the style in Germany brought it back in a big way. According to the style guide, the Baltic Porter is very deep ruby to black in color, medium to full body with noticeable malt sweetness and complexity. Aromas of caramelized sugars, licorice, chocolate-like notes of roasted malts and dark sugars are present. Some lager fruitiness such as berries, grapes, and plums can be present. Pretty high ABV, around the 7 to 9% range, so some alcohol warmth can be noticeable. Bitterness and hop aroma are low to none. Basically, we're looking at a deeply rich, elegantly sweet, yet darkly complex lager. Let's go ahead and take a look at our recipe. First off, we're starting with 9 pounds of 2-row. Pilsner or Munich work good as a base malt too, but I'm just sticking with the classic 2-row. Next, I'm adding 1.5 pounds of dark Munich, 12-ish SRM. I really like Munich malt, and it's always great to add to darker lager styles. Next is 12 ounces of Cara Munich malt, 35 SRM. Again, a great malt for bocks. I use this in my Oktoberfest and it adds such a nice sweetness. Then I'll toss in 1 pound of flaked oats. It's going to add a little body, but also give us some nice proteins that'll help out with head retention. Last up are dark roasted grains, where a little goes a long way. I'm going to be using 6 ounces of roasted barley, which adds some deep color and some great roasty character, and 6 ounces as well as some chocolate wheat. On top of all that, I'm throwing in about 1/2 pound of light brown sugar. It'll add a hint of molasses, but the sugar is going to ferment out and it's going to add a touch of dryness, which will help balance the overall sweetness of the beer. For our hops, we're keeping it low-key and herbal. We want to keep our IBUs up a bit just to balance the sweetness of the malts, but we don't want too much hop aroma and flavor. For that, we're just going to use a little bit of a high alpha acid hop to bitter with. 1/2 ounce of Magnum at 60 minutes in the boil should work nicely. Then around 15 minutes left in the boil, I'll throw in 1/2 ounce each of Saz and Hallertauer. Both mild and pleasant hops and go nicely in any lager style. To add a little extra warmth, spice, and smoothness, I'm also going to be tossing in a little cinnamon and vanilla when it's done fermenting. Just a tiny bit. I definitely don't want the cinnamon or vanilla to be noticeable on their own. I just want them to complement the rich malty flavors and bring everything together. And that'll do it for our recipe, which brings us to a projected 1.08 OG, about 29 IBUs, and around 26.6 SRM in color, which should all be pretty spot on for the style. Sweet. Alright, let's talk yeast. Now, on top of this beer being pretty high in ABV, we're also lagering it, which means that we're going to have to add a lot of yeast. Like, a lot of yeast. I'm going to be using this Omega OYL 114 German lager yeast, which is low on diacetyl and sulfur production and should give us a really nice crisp lager. I'm just using 1 pouch and I'm splitting it between 2 2-liter yeast starters. So let's go ahead and start boiling some wort. We're going to need about 4 liters, so I'm adding around 400 grams of dry malt extract to my water and letting that boil for a bit. After it's boiled for at least 10 minutes, we'll split that wort between 2 flasks and throw them in a little ice bath to cool off. Now that it's cooled off, we can add half the yeast to each flask. At this point, it's good to keep the yeast moving around, so I'm putting one on the stir plate. The other, I'll just have to periodically swirl it around as I think about it. We'll let these sit for 24 hours. We want the yeast to reach growth phase, but not so far into active fermentation before we step it up. Now that it's been going for about 24 hours, we're going to basically do it again. I'm going to get another 400 grams of DME on the boil. And in the meantime, we'll take the starter off the stir plate and we'll let the yeast settle down to the bottom. Okay, our DME is boiled, and now while we wait for that wort to cool down, we'll go ahead and carefully pour the liquid out of our flasks, leaving just the yeast behind. Now that our wort is chilled down, we can add it to our yeast and get them up and going again. Stepping up our starters by adding new wort should give us a lot more yeast to work with. Now, let's talk water. For the strike water, I'm going to be using a ratio of about 1.4 quarts per pound of grain, which will be about 4.5 gallons of distilled RO water. For good enzyme activity, we want our mash pH to be between 5.2 and 5.6, but for porters and stouts, I like to tend towards the higher end of that range to offset any acrid flavors from the dark roasted grains. Let's look at this neat water calculator from brewersfriend.com. We'll go ahead and set our water amounts, keeping the minerals to 0 for RO water, and the pH set to 7. And then down here, we can actually put in our grain bill. So I'll put that in now, making sure to set each malt type and include the SRM of each grain. And here we can already see our pH isn't bad, but still on the border of that window. Now when using RO water, it's good to add some calcium. Calcium and magnesium are great for beer, helping with enzyme activity as well as helping out with fermentation. We don't have to worry about magnesium though, because there's already a lot of that in the grain. But to add some calcium, we could either add gypsum or calcium chloride. Gypsum has sulfate, which is great for enhancing the bitterness of beer and is usually used in dry, hoppy styles. While chloride, on the other hand, helps smooth out the mouthfeel and is good for enhancing maltier properties of beer. This will come down to personal taste, but I'm going to go with about 5 grams of calcium chloride to give us the calcium we want, and we can see it put us in a good pH range as well without having to add anything else. For my setup, I'm using the Brewer's Edge Mash and Boil. You can get one off Adventures in Homebrewing for like $200. It's a handy little electric kettle with a grain tube that you lift up after the mash, and then I pop in the strainer, and then I use another electric kettle of heated tap water to do a nice easy sparge. To help with recirculation, I also got this nice little anvil pump. Alright, we'll pour in our 4.5 gallons of water, measure out our 5 grams of calcium chloride, and get that stirred in. Alright, we got our yeast starter stepped up, we got our water prepped, we got our equipment cleaned, got our pump hooked up, and we are ready for brew day tomorrow. See you then. Okay, it's brewing time. We got our strike water up to 162, which will drop down when we add the grain. So let's set our mash and boil to 152 and mash in. Give it a good stir, check our temp, make sure our pump is recirculating nicely, and we're going to mash for an hour, checking back every now and again to make sure our temps are on point and to give it a good stir. Alright, it's been 1 hour, so time to raise our temp for boil, lift up this grain tube, pop in our strainer, and start our sparge. Now, since we're lagering, we're going to need to ferment at lower temperatures, and to do that, I got this nice little mini fridge and hooked it up to an Inkbird temperature regulator. Now, unfortunately, while this fridge is just big enough to fit a corny keg, it's too small to fit my normal fermenter, which means we're going to be fermenting in a keg. And because we'll be fermenting in a keg, I need to make sure my batch volume is less than 5 gallons to be able to give it a little bit of headspace in there. I will be using a couple drops of Firm Cap S, which will make sure it doesn't foam up too much during active fermentation, but the cooler temps will already help with that too. We've sparged to about 5.5 gallons and the boil has started, so we'll go ahead and drop in our ½ pound of brown sugar and throw in our ½ ounce of Magnum. See ya in 45. 15 minutes left in our boil, and we'll throw in a ½ ounce each of Saz and Hallertauer, as well as a Whirlflock tablet. Alright, the boil is complete. We've dropped in our sanitized wort chiller and hooked it up to a hose to run cold water through it to chill it down. In the meantime, we can make sure our fermenting keg is set up and ready to go. To avoid transferring yeast sediment, I'm using this handy floating dip tube with a little mesh filter on the end. I'm not going to worry about fermenting under pressure, so I'm just going to take out this gas post poppet and this plastic bit out of the disconnect and set this up with a blow-off tube. Alright, the wort is nice and chilled, our gravity is on point reading 1.08. We'll pop our kettle up on this table, bring over our sanitized strainer, funnel, and keg, and just let her rip. To aerate our wort even more, I'm dropping in this aeration stone attached to an aquarium pump and pumping in some air for around 20 minutes. Let's go ahead and add a couple drops of Firm Cap S, decant our yeast starters, and pitch our yeast. I'm also sanitizing and dropping in this wireless hydrometer called the Tilt. It connects to a phone app via Bluetooth and can keep a constant eye on gravity and temperature throughout the whole fermentation. We'll cap it off, set it in our mini fridge set to 48, fermenting beer temp will be a bit higher. We'll tape our regulator probe to the keg, make sure our blow-off tube and growler are set up, and we're good to go. Now our fermentation schedule is to let it sit at 50 for 2 days, then slowly increase 1 degree a day for 10 days until we get to 60, and then we'll let it hang out at 60 until it looks like it's close to final gravity, and then I'll take it out of the fridge where my basement is around 70, let it warm up for a few days to ensure the yeast cleans up nicely. Then we're going to cold crash it before we do a closed transfer to a new keg, throw in our cinnamon and vanilla, and let it condition. Speaking of cinnamon and vanilla, let's talk about those flavor additions. I found a good way to add flavors like these is to infuse a small amount of vodka, filter it, and just add the vodka. It's basically like creating your own extract. For this, I'm going to crack a cinnamon stick, split a vanilla bean, and soak both of those in a few ounces of vodka. I let it sit for a week before filtering it, leaving me with a sort of cinnamon vanilla extract. I think I'll just be adding about 2 ounces of this to the beer. Alright, fermentation's now complete, and I was able to track it every day with the Tilt hydrometer, and it looks like it went really smooth. We had no trouble hitting a final gravity of 1.015. So now let's get our receiving keg ready. I filled it up with water and star sand and hooked that up to the CO2, and we'll use the pressure to empty out the keg, leaving us with just CO2 in the keg instead of oxygen. On our fermenting keg, we'll put our poppet back in our gas post and our stem and spring back into our disconnect and hook that up to the CO2. Then we'll hook up our liquid line from keg to keg and start increasing the pressure, forcing beer into the receiving keg. Meanwhile, I have a line from the gas post on the receiving keg dipped into a growler of sanitizer, and that'll allow CO2 to escape as it fills. This allows us a pretty much oxygen-free transfer, and since we're using the floating dip tube and we cold crashed, we're pushing extremely clean beer. Now that it's filled, I'll quickly toss in our cinnamon and vanilla flavoring. I think a little goes a long way, so I'm just going to add like 2 ounces, maybe even a little less. Then we'll go ahead and put this in the fridge, and at about 40 degrees we'll set our CO2 to 10 psi for medium carbonation, and we'll let that sit for about 2 weeks. And at that point we can break out our counter pressure filler and bottle this baby up. Now it's a few weeks later and it's time to bottle this up. I've washed some bottles and gave them a little bath and some sanitizer, and now they're all ready to be filled. I'm going to be using this counter pressure filler, which if you haven't used one, it's pretty great. I'm using some bigger lines, so I swapped out the barbs, and I got one side hooked up to the CO2 and the other side hooked up to the liquid out on my keg. Pressure set at about 5 psi. First, we take a bottle and we put the needle in up to the rubber stopper. Then we turn the nozzle to gas so it pressurizes the bottle, and then once it's pressurized, we can open the pressure relief valve and that'll purge oxygen from the bottle. When we close the valve, it will repressurize, and then we can turn our nozzle from gas to liquid. And then we open the pressure relief valve slightly, and then beer starts to fill in the bottle from the bottom up. Now you want to go slow, and if you use cold beer and cold bottles, it will really reduce your foam. Once it hits the top, I'll open the pressure relief valve a bit to let some foam out. Then I'll close it, turn the nozzle off, and then we can pop a cap right on it. And there you go. It's already carbonated and good to go. No adding priming sugar and ending up with yeast sediment in every bottle. It takes some time, but I think it's well worth it in the end. Alright, well, we filled up about 40 bottles, and now we can clean out our empty keg and get it ready for another brew. I'm going to take these bottles, I'm going to put them in a box, I'm going to store them here in the basement away from the light around 65 degrees, and I'll let them sit for at least a month before I chill and pop one open. Can't wait though, I'll see you then. Alright, it's been a month, and at long last we can finally crack one of these open and see what it tastes like. You can see I made a neat little label for it. But yeah, let's get to it. Alright, yeah, it's pretty black. If you hold it up to the light, you can see some nice ruby notes shine through it. It's pretty clear. Got a little tiny head on it. Smells malty. You got some roasty toastiness in there. Yeah, a little bit of fruit, maybe a little bit of plum. Alright, let's give it a taste. Oh, wow. That is super sweet. Very smooth, beautiful soft mouthfeel. Not too sticky sweet though, you know. I think that that little bit of the lagerness comes through. And it doesn't taste like it's 8.6%, but it is strong. That is delicious. Wow. Yeah, a lot of that nice, maybe a little bit of molasses, a little bit of licorice. That is a good beer. I like that. All right. Well, yeah, that's pretty much it. I know I blazed through some of this video just for the sake of time. So if you have any questions on any part of the process, or if there's anything specific you want to see, feel free to leave a comment. And that's pretty much it. Well, cheers, happy homebrewing, and I'll see you next time.